Lieutenant Kyle Morrison sat alone in his small room aboard the Earth Defense Force ship called Horizon's Edge, and he stared at his computer screen with tired eyes that had seen too many long shifts in space and the newest virtual reality game was loading slowly on his outdated terminal, and he watched the progress bar creep forward while wondering if this game would be worth the credits he had spent on it. And Blocked Galaxy was the name that appeared on his screen, in bold letters. And beneath it were promises of epic space battles and strategic warfare that would test even the most experienced commanders in ways they had never imagined before. And he had heard stories from other crew members about this game and how it was different from everything else on the market right now, and the premise was simple enough to understand, but difficult to master, according to the reviews he had read during his lunch break, and humans had just discovered faster than light travel in this game universe. And they had rushed out into the galaxy, expecting to find empty space and unclaimed worlds. But instead, they found something much worse, and 12 ancient alien empires controlled the galaxy, and they had been there for thousands of years, and they had technology that made human achievements look like children playing with wooden blocks. And Kyle created his character, and named him Captain Danny Pierce, after his grandfather who had served in the old Navy back on Earth, and the character creation screen showed him 3 outdated human corvettes that looked like they had been patched together from scrap metal and spare parts, and his starting mission was a tutorial that would teach him the basics of combat and movement and resource management. And a single Zrathian destroyer appeared on his tactical display, and it was 5 times more powerful than all 3 of his ships combined. And the game warned him that human technology was centuries behind the galactic standard, and that he would need to use cunning instead of firepower to survive. And Kyle read the warning twice, and then he looked at the battlefield that was displayed on his screen, and an asteroid field stretched across the space between his position and the enemy destroyer, and he could see gravity wells and radiation zones marked in red, and the Zrathian destroyer was moving in a standard patrol pattern that suggested its commander was following some kind of doctrine or training manual. And he split his 3 ships and sent them on different courses through the asteroid field, while the enemy destroyer turned to intercept, and arg, the Zrathian ship fired its weapons, and the blasts tore through space where Kyle's ships had been just seconds before. And he kept his corvettes moving and dodging and using the asteroids as cover while the enemy continued to fire at all him with weapons that could have destroyed his entire fleet in minutes if they had connected properly. And 20 minutes passed, and Kyle had not fired a single shot at the enemy destroyer, and his ships had taken minor damage from glancing blows and near misses. But they were still functional and still moving, and the Zrathian commander seemed frustrated based on the increasingly aggressive maneuvers the destroyer was making, and Kyle positioned his 3 corvettes carefully on 3 sides of 2 massive asteroids, and then he waited for the enemy to move into position between them, and the destroyer followed one of his ships and moved directly between the 2 asteroids, just as Kyle had planned, and he gave the order, and all 3 corvettes fired at the asteroids instead of at the enemy ship, and the weapons tore into the rock and destabilized the ancient structures that had been floating in space for millions of years, and thousands of tons of rock and metal collapsed inward and crushed the Zrathian destroyer with kinetic, the force that no shield could have stopped. And the game displayed a message that said, "Tutorial complete and unconventional victory achieved, and bonus rewards granted." And Kyle leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time in days. He was starting to understand why human players loved this game so much, and why alien players complained about it on the forums. And the game rewarded thinking and creativity, instead of just having bigger guns and stronger shields. And he spent the next hour playing through the early missions and learning the game mechanics that would become second nature after enough practice. And human ships were slower than alien ships, and they had weaker weapons, and their shields could wither hardy experienced divide, barely stop a strong solar wind. But they were cheap to build and easy to replace, and they could be modified in ways that alien ships could not. And whereas Zrathian player would spend 100 million credits on a single battleship, Kyle, he could build 20 corvettes for the same price. And the game gave him small victories that built his confidence and taught him lessons about asymmetric warfare. And he learned to avoid direct confrontations and to strike from unexpected ATC angles and to retreat before the enemy could respond. And he learned that patience was more valuable than aggression, and that a small force used cleverly could defeat a large force used poorly. And every mission taught him something new about how to fight enemies that were stronger and faster and more advanced than he was. And Kyle found himself thinking about the game even when he was not playing it. And during his shift on the bridge of the horizon's edge, he would stare at the stars and imagine how he would fight a battle in that sector of space. And he would look at asteroid fields and nebulae and gravity wells and see tactical opportunities instead of navigation hazards. And his commanding officer noticed his distraction but said nothing, because Kyle still performed his duties well enough. And after a week of playing several hours each night, Kyle had progressed from commanding 3 corvettes to leading a battle group of 12 ships. And the missions were getting harder. And the BAW groups of Hizmet speeds, enemy AI was adapting to his tactics faster than he could adapt to theirs. And the Velcor swarm learned from every engagement. And they changed their strategies to counter whatever Kyle had used against them last time. And the Cathari ascendancy seemed to predict his movements before he made them, and they were always waiting in the places he wanted to go. But Kyle noticed something important about the game design that many other players seemed to miss. And the aliens were better at everything except one thing. And that one thing was adaptation. And human ships could be retrofitted and modified and completely rebuilt between missions. And alien ships were locked into their designs by tradition and doctrine. Pride and a Zrathian battleship would always fight like a Zrathian battleship because that was what Zrathians did. But a human corvette could fight like anything Kyle imagined, and he began experimenting with unconventional loadouts and strange tactics that made no sense, according to military doctrine. And he put mining lasers on warships and used them to destabilize asteroids. And he mounted electronic warfare systems on scout ships and used them to jam enemy communications. And he even built ships with no weapons at all and used them as decoys and distractions, while his real attack force struck from another direction entirely. And the game rewarded every creative solution with victory and resources and new opportunities. And Kyle closed the game late that night and prepared for sleep, but his mind was still running through tactics and strategies. The next few weeks passed quickly for Kyle, as he spent every free moment playing Blocked Galaxy and climbing through the ranks of human commanders, and his character Danny Pierce was becoming well known among the player community, and other humans would send him messages, asking for advice or requesting to join his fleet for cooperative missions. And he accepted some of these requests and formed a small group of regular players who shared his approach to the game. And Lieutenant Amy Brooks was the first person to join his regular group, and she specialized in hit-and-run attacks that left enemy fleets confused and damaged. And she commanded fast frigates that could strike at supply convoys and retreat before reinforcements arrived. And Commander Jake Warren joined next, and he was the opposite of Amy in every way, because he built defensive formations that could hold a position against overwhelming odds. And Lieutenant Melissa Chang was the last to join, and she was perhaps the most valuable member because she understood mathematics and probability in ways that seemed almost supernatural, and together they formed a command group that other human players started to call the Morrison Pack, and they began taking on missions that single players could not complete alone. And the game scaled difficulty based on group size and comport coordination, and it threw challenges at them that required perfect timing and trust. And Kyle found himself learning as much from his teammates as they learned from him, and their combined tactics became more sophisticated with each passing day. And the real test of their abilities came during a massive multiplayer event that the game developers announced with great fanfare. And 500 players would be divided into racial factions, and they would fight for control of a police star cluster that was rich in resources and strategic value, and humanity fielded 70 players against hundreds of aliens, who commanded superior fleets and better technology, and the odds were not in their favor, according to every calculation that Melissa ran through her analysis programs, and Kyle gathered the human commanders in a voice chat channel, and he listened to their concerns and fears about the upcoming battle, and many of them wanted to fight defensively, and protect their territory, and wait for the aliens to make mistakes. But Kyle had learned something important during his weeks of playing this game, and he knew that defensive play was exactly what the aliens expected from humans, and they expected humans to be scared and cautious and predictable, and he proposed something different and radical and possibly insane, and the human players would scatter across the entire star cluster instead of concentrating their forces, and they would strike at supply lines and resource nodes and isolated enemy squadrons, and they would refuse to fight any battle that the aliens wanted to fight, and they would only engage on their own terms, and when alien fleets gathered to crush, to them the humans would disappear into nebulae and asteroid fields and empty space. And Amy Brooks loved the idea immediately, and she started planning raid routes that would maximize chaos and minimize risk. And Jake Warren was more cautious, but he agreed to set up fallback positions where damaged ships could retreat and repair, and Melissa Chang began writing algorithms that would help coordinate the scattered human forces and predict where alien fleets would move based on their previous patterns, and the battle began on a Saturday morning, and Kyle had requested the day off from his duties aboard the Horizon's Edge, and he sat at his computer with coffee and snacks and a determination to see this through, no matter how long it took, and the star cluster appeared on his tactical display. And he watched as hundreds of ships from 12 different alien races moved into their starting positions, and the aliens organized themselves into 3 massive fleets that would sweep through the cluster and overwhelm any resistance through sheer firepower. And Kyle gave the order. And 70 human players scattered in 70 different directions, and the aliens pursued. But they could not chase everyone at once, and they had to make choices about which targets were most important, and while they were making those choices, human raiders were hitting their supply depots, and mining operations, and shipyards, and resources that the aliens needed to maintain their large fleets were being destroyed faster than they could protect them, and 3 hours into the battle, and the alien commanders were becoming frustrated according to the communications that Melissa intercepted and decoded, and their fleets were strong, but they could not be everywhere at once, and humans kept appearing in places where they should not be, and a Zrathian battle group would arrive to defend a mining station, only to find it already destroyed and the attackers gone, and a Velcor swarm would chase a human frigate into an asteroid field and lose 3 ships to mines that had been placed there hours earlier, and the aliens tried to adapt by splitting their forces into smaller groups that could respond faster to threats. This was exactly what Kyle had hoped they would do, because smaller groups were vulnerable to ambush and concentrated fire. And he coordinated with Jake Warren to set up a trap in a nebula that blocked long-range sensors. And when a Cathari, the patrol of 5 ships entered the nebula, looking for human raiders, they found 15 human ships waiting for them instead. And 6 hours into the battle, and the momentum had completely shifted, and the aliens had started with superior numbers and technology, but they were losing the economic war that was happening behind the combat, and their resource production had dropped by 60%, and their ability to replace lost ships was crippled. And meanwhile, the human players had been building new corvettes and frigates at a steady rate because their cheap ships could be produced quickly, even during active combat, and the alien commanders made a desperate decision that Kyle saw coming from miles away, and they would stop chasing the human raiders, and they would strike directly at the human staging area, where all the human shipyards and resource processors were located. And if they could destroy the human production capacity, then the raiding would eventually stop because there would be no ships left to replace losses. And it was logical. And it was exactly what military doctrine said they should do. But Kyle had been counting on this decision, and he had prepared for it days ago. And every human ship in the star cluster suddenly stopped raiding and began moving toward the staging area from 100 different directions. And the aliens arrived first, and they found the staging area defended by automated platforms and minefields and stationary weapons, and they began their attack. And then the human fleet arrived behind them and around them and above them. And the battle became a slaughter. And there was no other word for what happened in that space, and the aliens lost half their combined fleet in less than an hour, and the remaining ships retreated in disorder, and humanity won the star cluster, and the game forums exploded with discussion, and alien players demanded balance changes, and human players celebrated, and the developers released a statement. That said, working as intended, and adaptation, is the core gameplay mechanic. And Kyle logged off that night, exhausted but satisfied. And he had proven that human tactics could work on a massive scale against coordinated alien opposition. 3 months had passed since Kyle first logged into Blocked Galaxy, and the game had consumed more of his life than he wanted to admit to anyone, including himself. And he had reached the top ranks of human commanders, and his tactics were being studied and copied by thousands of other players, and the game had evolved beyond simple space combat, and the developers had released a major expansion pack that changed everything about how the game was played, and the expansion was called the Council's Decree, and it introduced galactic politics into the game mechanics, and the 12 alien races, and humanity now sat on a council where they could propose laws and vote on regulations that would affect all players, regardless of their faction. And Kyle watched the announcement trailer with growing concern because he understood immediately how this would be used against human players who had been winning too much lately. And the first council session happened on a Tuesday evening, and Kyle joined the virtual chamber, along with representatives from all 13 races, and the Zrathian delegate proposed a law called the Human Exclusion Protocol, and the name alone told Kyle everything he needed to know about what was coming. And the proposal would limit human fleet sizes to prevent the swarming tactics that had become humanity's signature strategy in every major battle, and the vote proceeded exactly as Kyle expected it. Wood and 12 alien races voted yes, while humanity voted no, and the measure passed with overwhelming support, and the game immediately implemented the new restrictions, and human players could still build unlimited ships, but they could not field them all in a single battle anymore. And the forums exploded with angry posts from human players who felt cheated by the rule change, and many threatened to quit the game entirely, and Kyle read through the expansion's full patch notes, while other players complained, and he noticed something interesting. Buried in the technical details, and the restrictions only applied to individual battles and engagements. But there was no limit on how many separate battles could be happening simultaneously, and the aliens thought they had neutralized humanity's greatest advantage, but they had actually given humans an excuse to fight the way they had always wanted to fight. And he called an emergency meeting with Amy Brooks and Jake Warren and Melissa Chang, and he laid out his idea while they listened in silence. And instead of fighting in large, decisive battles, humanity would fight everywhere at once, in hundreds of small engagements. And the aliens had powerful fleets, but they were slow to redeploy, and they could not be in multiple places simultaneously. And human ships were fast and cheap, and could be everywhere. And Amy understood immediately, and she started laughing at the genius of it. And Jake was more cautious as always, but even he could see the potential in this approach. And Melissa began running calculations, and within an hour, she had built a model that showed how distributed warfare could actually be more effective than concentrated battles. And the aliens had thought they were limiting humanity, but they had actually forced humans to become even more unpredictable and dangerous. And the human player community numbered over 2,000 active commanders by this point, and they organized themselves into a loose command structure, with Kyle as one of 5 strategic coordinators, and they divided the known galaxy into sectors and assigned commanders to each one with specific objectives and goals, and no single engagement would be decisive. But the cumulative effect would be devastating to any race that tried to fight them. And the alien players did not understand what was happening at first. And they saw scattered human raids as nothing more than nuisance attacks. The Zrathian collective launched a massive invasion of a heavily defended human colony world, and they committed 3 full battle fleets to the assault. And it was the largest military operation in the game's history. And every tactical analyst predicted that the human colony would fall within days, and Kyle was light years away when the attack began, and he made no move to send reinforcements to the besieged world. And instead, he gathered 60 human commanders and led them in a coordinated strike against 12 Zrathian shipyards and 3 major trading hubs. And the attacks happened simultaneously, across a region of space that was thousands of light years across. And Zrathian infrastructure burned, and their economy collapsed, and their supply lines were cut, and the Zrathian fleets besieging the human colony suddenly found themselves in a desperate situation because they had no way to get ammunition or fuel or replacement parts, and the human defenders held their ground and waited, while the attackers slowly ran out of resources. And 2 weeks later, the Zrathian commander withdrew his forces in defeat, and he had captured nothing while losing everything, and similar patterns repeated across the galaxy over the following months, and alien players began to understand that something fundamental had changed, and the Velcor swarm would gather their forces for a major offensive, and then they would discover that their colony worlds were under attack by human raiders, and the Cathari ascendancy tried to defend their trade routes, but they could not protect everything and fight battles at the same time, and the game's story missions began to reflect the changing strategic situation and missions that once showed humanity as desperate underdogs now portrayed human fleets striking deep into alien territory with impunity, and non-player characters started referring to the human problem. And some alien NPCs even used the word infestation when talking about human expansion, and Kyle knew that humanity was winning when alien players stopped complaining about balance on the forums and started asking questions about human tactics instead. And he saw Zrathian commanders adopting hit and run strategies that they had learned from fighting humans, and Velcor players were experimenting with guerrilla warfare concepts that came from human military history, and even the proud Cathari were studying Earth's ancient wars to understand how weaker forces could defeat stronger ones. But the aliens were not ready to accept defeat, and they had one final option available to them through the council system, and an emergency session was called, and all 12 alien races proposed a joint resolution that they called the Quarantine Directive. And the proposal would establish a blockade around human-controlled space and prevent humanity from expanding further into the galaxy. And Kyle watched the vote with a sinking feeling in his stomach, because he knew it would pass easily, and 12 votes in favor and 1 vote against, and the resolution became law, and the expansion's title suddenly made perfect sense, because Blocked Galaxy was about to become literal instead of metaphorical, and humanity would be trapped behind a wall of alien warships, and the game would test whether humans could break free or slowly die behind their cage, and the event triggered automatically, and Kyle's screen showed him a cinematic cutscene of alien fleets gathering at every border of human space, and thousands of ships from all 12 races formed a defensive line that surrounded the 40-star systems humanity controlled, and jump gates were locked down with military codes, and warp routes were patrolled by overlapping sensor networks, and the blockade was complete, and escape seemed impossible, and a message appeared on Kyle's screen from the game developers, and it said, "This was humanity's final challenge." The Quarantine Directive changed everything about how the game was played, and Kyle found himself staring at a strategic map that showed nothing but red enemy markers surrounding a tiny bubble of blue human territory, and the blockade fleet outnumbered human forces by a ratio of 10 to 1, and every simulation that Melissa ran showed failure rates above 90% for any kind of direct assault. And the alien races had finally learned to work together, and they had created something that seemed truly unbreakable. and Kyle convened an emergency meeting of the Human Strategic Council. And 2,000 commanders joined the voice channel to hear his assessment. And the mood was grim, and many players were already talking about quitting, because the situation seemed hopeless, and Amy Brooks reported that preliminary scout missions had confirmed the blockade was rotating shifts to prevent fatigue, and that supply lines were redundant, and Jake Warren added that defensive positions were overlapping and mutually supporting, and there were no weak points to exploit, and he spent days studying the blockade patterns and looking for any kind of weakness or vulnerability that could be exploited, and the aliens had learned from all their previous mistakes, and they had built something that accounted for every trick humanity had used before, and communication networks were encrypted with military-grade codes, and sensor coverage was complete, overlapping and patrol routes were random and unpredictable, and it was a perfect siege by every measure. And Kyle began reading through the game's background lore, because he had exhausted all conventional options and needed to find something unconventional. And the codex entries described the history of the galaxy and the formation of the Council 15,000 years ago, and the 12 alien races had fought a devastating war that nearly destroyed galactic civilization, and they had only stopped fighting when mutual exhaustion forced them to make peace, and the war had been triggered by the extinction of a race called the Architects, who had created the jump gate network that everyone used for faster-than-light travel. And when the Architects fell, the 12 races fought over control of the ancient technology, until there was almost nothing left to fight over, and the eventual peace treaty established rules about how gates could be used and maintained. And Kyle read deeper into the codex entries about the Architects and their lost civilization. And the jump gate network was their greatest creation. And even after 15,000 years, modern races still did not fully understand how the gates worked, and everyone used the gates the same basic way, by entering at one location and exiting at another, predetermined destination. But the codex mentioned dormant protocols and undiscovered capabilities that had been lost when the Architects disappeared, and he called another council meeting and proposed an idea that sounded crazy even to his own ears. And what if humanity dedicated all their resources to researching the jump gates instead of building more weapons and ships? And what if there were functions and capabilities that no one had discovered yet? And what if the Architects had built features into the network that could bypass the standard routes everyone used? And Amy Brooks thought he was losing his mind from stress, and she said so directly, and Jake Warren was more diplomatic but clearly skeptical about spending resources on research when they needed ships to break the blockade. And Melissa Chang was the only one who seemed interested, and she asked what kind of research he had in mind, and Kyle explained that the game had a research mechanic that most players ignored, because combat was more exciting, but humanity had 2,000 active players, and they could crowdsource the research effort, having each player contribute a small amount, and if they pooled their efforts, they might discover something that would change the strategic situation completely. And the vote was close, but the plan passed with 53% support, and thousands of human players began running research missions that involved scanning gate structures and analyzing ancient data cores and translating fragments of architect language, and progress was slow, and many players complained that they were wasting time that could be spent building defenses. And Kyle ignored the complaints and kept pushing forward, because he believed this was their only chance. And 6 weeks of real-time effort produced results that exceeded even Kyle's optimistic expectations, and the human research teams discovered that jump gates could be temporarily modified to create unstable wormholes that were one-way portals to random locations, and these wormholes bypassed the standard network completely and could not be predicted or blocked by conventional means. And the Architects had apparently built this feature as an emergency escape system, but it had been forgotten over thousands of years. And Kyle proposed a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane, depending on who you asked. And humanity would evacuate most of their 40 star systems and concentrate the population in just 5 heavily fortified worlds and the other 35 systems would be converted entirely to industrial production, and they would build ships at maximum capacity without worrying about defense. And then they would use the unstable wormholes to send the largest fleet in human history directly into the 40s. The heart of alien territory, and the alien blockade would be sitting uselessly at the border while human forces attacked their homeworlds and core systems, and the aliens would have to choose between maintaining the blockade or defending their homes, and either choice would be a disaster for them strategically. And Amy Brooks warned that the aliens would slaughter the human colonies that were left behind when the main fleet departed. And Kyle acknowledged this was possible, but he believed the aliens would break their own blockade to chase the human fleet and defend their territory. And it was a massive gamble with the lives of millions of virtual civilians. But every other option led to slow death behind the blockade. And the human players voted, and 78% supported the plan, despite its risks, and over the next month of game time, 35 human systems were stripped of everything except industrial facilities and shipyards. And the populations evacuated to the 5 fortress worlds that Jake Warren had designed to withstand siege warfare, and production ramped up to levels that the game had never seen before. And ships came off the assembly lines faster than they could be crewed. And 10,000 human ships gathered in secret locations throughout the 40 systems and prepared for the largest military operation in Blocked Galaxy's history. And Kyle coordinated with his fellow strategic coordinators to assign targets and timing, and every alien race would be hit simultaneously in their core territories, and shipyards and orbital stations and industrial centers would burn, and the operation launched on a Sunday morning, and Kyle had taken a full day off from his duties aboard the Horizon's Edge, and he watched his screen as 10,000 ships jumped through unstable wormholes and disappeared from the blockade sensors. And the alien commanders did not understand what was happening at first, because humans were supposed to be trapped behind the blockade, and then the reports started coming in from deep inside alien territory, and the scope of the human operation became clear. Kyle sat in his quarters aboard the Horizon's Edge, 6 months after he had first logged into Blocked Galaxy, and he found himself reading through forum posts instead of playing the game, and the discussion threads were fascinating, because they showed how much the player community had changed over the past half year, and alien players who had once complained about balance were now writing detailed analysis posts about human tactics and strategy, and Zrathian commanders discussed the importance of creative thinking in warfare, and Velcor strategists debated the value of unpredictability in combat, and even the proud Cathari posted thoughtful essays about respecting enemy ingenuity, and the developers had Cathari released a statement the previous week that addressed all the controversy about whether the game was balanced or fair. And they explained that Blocked Galaxy had been designed as a simulation of asymmetric conflict from the very beginning, and humanity's disadvantages in technology and firepower were intentionally balanced by advantages in adaptability and numbers, and the metagame that had emerged was exactly what they had hoped to create, and the unstable wormhole operation had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and the alien blockade had collapsed within 2 months of game time, and the 12 races had faced an impossible choice between maintaining their siege or defending their homeworlds, and they had made the worst possible decision by trying to do both, and their forces were divided and weakened and unable to match human mobility, and the quarantine directive was abandoned, and the Alien Council called for peace negotiations, and Kyle logged into the game one final time before writing his review, and he found his character, Captain Danny Pierce, standing on the bridge of a flagship that commanded a legendary fleet, and the game offered him a new campaign called The Frontier Wars, where humanity would expand into unclaimed regions of space, but he found himself more interested in a different notification that had appeared in his message inbox, and the Zrathian Collective had sent a formal diplomatic request asking for human advisors to help train their commanders in unconventional warfare, and the message was polite and respectful, and it acknowledged that the expectives Zrathians had learned valuable lessons from fighting against humanity, and the Velcor swarm had sent a similar request for joint military exercises, and even the Cathari Ascendancy had transmitted a message that praised humanity's strategic contributions to galactic security, and Amy Brooks sent him a private message that simply asked if the game had been worth playing, and Kyle thought about the question while he watched his fleet patrol a sector of space that humans had conquered through cleverness rather than firepower. And he had spent hundreds of hours in this virtual universe, and he had led thousands of players in coordinated campaigns against impossible odds, and he had faced enemies that were stronger and faster and more advanced in every measurable way, and he had lost battles and questioned his strategies and wanted to quit more than once. But he had also learned something important about persistence and adaptation and creative problem-solving, and the game had forced him to think differently about challenges and obstacles. And when conventional approaches failed, he had learned to find unconventional solutions. And when direct confrontation was impossible, he learned to strike from unexpected angles. And when resources were limited, he had learned to use what he had in ways that multiplied its effectiveness. And Kyle typed his response to Amy and told her, yes, the game had been worth playing, and then he opened the game's review page and spent 20 minutes writing his thoughts about Blocked Galaxy. And he gave it 5 stars, without hesitation. And his review explained why he thought other players should experience this game for themselves, and he wrote that Blocked Galaxy delivered on its promise of challenging alien space battles where players would face superior technology and overwhelming numbers, and he explained that playing as humanity meant losing battles and questioning strategies and feeling outmatched in every conventional measure. But he also wrote that persistence and adaptation and creativity were rewarded in ways that made victory feel earned rather than given. And the game asked one fundamental question, according to Kyle's review, and that question was whether cleverness could defeat raw power, and when you faced enemies with bigger ships and better weapons and stronger shields, could you still find ways to win through unconventional tactics and strategic thinking and for humanity in the game? The answer had always been yes, and Blocked Galaxy let players prove this truth through gameplay that rewarded intelligence over firepower, and Kyle recommended the game highly for anyone who enjoyed strategic depth and asymmetric challenges and the satisfaction of beating impossible odds through smart play rather than superior equipment. And he submitted the review and closed his computer because his shift would start in less than an hour, and the real Horizon's Edge was preparing to depart for a patrol mission in the outer colonies, and he needed to be on the bridge when they left dock. But he found himself thinking about the lessons he had learned from a video game and wondering if those lessons applied to real life as well, and Blocked Galaxy was fiction and entertainment. But the underlying principles seemed authentic and true, and humans in the real world had always faced challenges that seemed impossible, and they had always found ways to adapt and overcome and survive, and that pattern stretched back through thousands of years of human history. And Kyle stood up and straightened his uniform and checked his appearance in the small mirror mounted on his wall, and he looked tired, but satisfied, and ready for whatever challenges his shift would bring. And somewhere, out in the real galaxy, other races might exist with technology beyond human understanding, and someday Earth might encounter aliens who considered humanity primitive and weak, and if that day ever came, Kyle hoped those aliens had learned the lesson that Blocked Galaxy taught so effectively, and never underestimate the species that refuses to accept impossible as an answer, and never assume that superior technology guarantees victory, and never believe that conventional advantages are the only factors that matter in conflict. And he walked toward the bridge of the Horizon's Edge and thought about how a simple video game had changed his perspective on challenges and obstacles, and the game was entertainment. But the spirit behind it felt authentically human, and that refusal to quit, and that drive to adapt, and that determination to find solutions no matter how impossible the situation seemed, and those were not just game mechanics or story elements. And those were fundamental aspects of what made humanity unique, and Lieutenant Kyle Morrison reached the bridge and took his station at the tactical console, and the commanding officer gave the order to depart, and the ship pulled away from the station and accelerated toward deep space. And Kyle monitored his displays and performed his duties with practiced efficiency. But part of his mind was still thinking about blocked galaxy and the lessons he had learned from commanding virtual fleets against impossible odds, and the game had asked whether humanity could win when outgunned and outclassed and outnumbered, and Kyle had spent 6 months proving the answer was yes, through creative tactics and persistent effort and refusal to accept defeat. And now, he wondered if he could apply those same principles to his real life and his real career. And the universe was vast and full of challenges and mysteries, and humanity was just beginning to explore the space beyond Earth's solar system. And whatever they found out there in the darkness between stars, Kyle believed humanity would adapt and overcome and survive. And that was what humans did best, according to both history and fiction. And Blocked Galaxy had been worth playing not just because it was fun or challenging, but because it reminded him of something important about his own species. And humans were not the strongest or fastest or most advanced, but they were adaptable and creative and stubborn beyond all reason. And when faced with impossible situations, they found ways to change the rules or redefine victory or attack from angles no one expected. And that spirit, and that determination, and that refusal to quit was humanity's greatest strength in any universe, whether real or virtual. And the horizon's edge jumped to faster than light speed, and the stars stretched into lines of light across Kyle's display. And he smiled slightly as he monitored the tactical systems and watched for threats that probably did not exist yet. And the game was over, but the lessons remained, and that made every hour he had spent playing Blocked Galaxy absolutely worth it in ways he was still discovering.